The Globe Theatre of Boston, 1907, was a monument to opulence and illusion. Its chandeliers, dripping with crystal and firelight, cast a deceptive warmth over the plush seating where the city's elite gathered. They came not just for entertainment, but to be fooled, to pay a high price for a temporary suspension of reality. Tonight, the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Above the stage, a gold leaf banner declared the master's title, the Great Quillian, Master of Illusion. Quillian was more than a magician. He was a phenomenon. Tall, severe, and possessing an unerringly intense gaze, he commanded the room with minimal effort. He spoke little, letting his mastery of stagecraft do the work. The audience adored him for his theatrical flair and the sheer impossibility of his tricks. Tonight's final act, the celestial suspension, promised to be his greatest triumph, defying gravity and logic itself. Patrons at the closest tables sipped champagne, their eyes fixed on the velvet curtain, eager to witness the culmination of the evening. They saw gilded moldings, rich velvet, and shining brass, a perfect, self-contained world of artifice. Yet, beneath the lavish facade, the globe was little more than a gilded cage, holding the secrets of levers, wires, and trapdoors. Tonight, however, the cage would fail to contain one of its occupants, and the facade of the world's order would crack for everyone present. Miss Adeline was the indispensable counterpart to Quillian's rigid showmanship. She was a silent, ethereal presence, a beautiful, haunting figure in her pale gowns. The audience saw her as the perfect embodiment of the magic, weightless, fragile, and utterly subject to the master's will. Rumors clung to her like stage dust. Some said she was a destitute aristocrat, others, a dancer Quillian had rescued from poverty. In truth, Adeline was an enigma even to those backstage. She moved with a strange, deliberate detachment, as if the theater, the audience, and the great Quillian himself were merely momentary distractions. Her eyes held a constant, distant quality, never quite focusing on the here and now. This unearthly quality was, ironically, her greatest asset in the illusion. She genuinely looked like she was ready to drift away. Backstage, their interactions were chillingly minimal. There were no friendly gestures, no shared glances of triumph. Quillian treated her like a crucial, yet disposable, piece of equipment. He demanded absolute silence and obedience, and she provided it with a chilling efficiency. It was a partnership founded not on trust or affection, but on a shared, silent tension, a tension that hinted at a deeper, unspoken compact. Tonight, as she prepared for the celestial suspension, her detachment was even more profound, suggesting she was already halfway to a place the audience couldn't see. The house lights dimmed, plunging the Globe Theatre into hushed anticipation. A single, sharp spotlight centered on the stage. Quillian, having removed his gloves with a dramatic slowness, commanded silence. This was his masterpiece, the act of levitation he claimed was inspired by ancient, lost arts. With a bow toward the wings, he summoned Miss Adeline. She emerged, radiant yet remote, moving toward a small, elaborately carved mahogany pedestal positioned center stage. She reclined upon it, her white gown spreading like mist over the dark wood. Quillian covered her with a shimmering, thin silk sheet, a formality that was quickly pulled away to reveal her, still serene, still waiting. He began the ritual, slow, deliberate passes of his hands above her form, whispering words the audience couldn't hear, yet felt in their chests. The atmosphere was thick with manufactured electricity. Then, with a sudden, powerful gesture, he removed the pedestal itself. The audience gasped as Adeline remained perfectly horizontal, floating several feet above the stage floor. There were no visible wires, no mirrors, just a woman suspended by an unseen force. Quillian stood back, his arms crossed, a look of profound, cold triumph etched on his face. The audience erupted in a deafening wave of applause. The illusion was flawless. Yet, this time, as the applause peaked, Quillian didn't step forward to bow. He took a subtle step back, watching Adeline with an intensity that bordered on fear. The flawless suspension had begun, but tonight, something had taken the lead out of the master's hands. The ecstatic applause of the audience was a shield, masking a terrifying stillness on the stage. Quillian stood perfectly still, his tuxedo immaculate, his top hat shadowing his eyes. The applause should have been his cue to step forward, to take a bow, to bring the beautiful illusion to its controlled conclusion. But he didn't move. He couldn't. He saw the first fault, the change in Miss Adeline's expression. Earlier, it had been a trained look of serenity, a theatrical stillness designed to aid the trick. Now, that calm had deepened into something genuinely unsettling, a profound, terrifying vacancy. Her eyes, fixed on a point above the balcony, held no recognition, no sign of the woman he knew. It was the gaze of a sleepwalker, or perhaps someone who had already left. A trickle of cold sweat ran down Quillian's temple, unseen by the cheering crowd. He tried to project the mental command, the silent count they always used, but the connection was dead. The energy he usually drew from the crowd to sustain the illusion felt wrong. Too heavy, too real. He knew the weight of every wire, every lever, every mirror in his theater. But the force holding Adeline aloft felt alien, unaccountable. The master of illusion was no longer in control of his masterpiece. He was merely a spectator to an act he had accidentally set in motion. As Quillian stood paralyzed, the illusion began to manifest physical impossibilities. A woman in the front row, adjusting her spectacles, leaned over and whispered to her husband, "My dear, is it warm in here?" Indeed, the air immediately surrounding Miss Adeline was no longer cool stage air. It was radiating a subtle, unnatural heat. It began with a shimmer. The light from the single spotlight, which should have been crisp, now distorted around Adeline's form. It was like looking at something through a glass pane on a searing summer day, a subtle, undulating distortion of the background tapestry. Her white gown, already bright, seemed to grow unnaturally luminous, almost painful to look at directly. Then came the tremble. It wasn't the shaking of fear or discomfort, but a rapid high-frequency vibration that ran through her suspended body. Her arms, which had been perfectly slack, seemed to vibrate along the edges. The stage floor itself seemed to absorb the tremor, and a few close-seated audience members felt a strange, low-frequency hum beneath their feet. Quillian watched, his breath catching in his throat. He saw the threads of reality fraying, not through his expertly crafted mechanisms, but through some terrifying, inherent flaw in the fabric of the moment. He tried to move, to shout a command, to break the spell, but the unnatural brilliance emanating from Adeline held him in a trance of pure, cold dread. The celestial suspension had become a crucible, and his assistant was quickly nearing a point of irreversible transformation. Quillian knew, in that gut-wrenching second, that he had to stop it. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched, intending to grab Adeline, to pull her down, to break the sinister connection. But he was too late. Just as his fingers were inches from the hem of her shimmering gown, the high-frequency trembling reached its peak. It wasn't a physical rupture, it was a subtle, terrifying dissolution. The shimmering air around Adeline intensified into a blinding flash of white light, a light that lasted less than a heartbeat and seemed to swallow sound. The audience, now sensing the profound wrongness, had fallen into a stunned, collective silence. Into this silence, the only sound was a soundless pop, a deep, visceral sensation, not heard by the ears, but felt in the chest, like the sudden release of immense pressure. When the flash subsided, the space above the stage was empty. Miss Adeline was gone. Not fallen, not slipped, but utterly and completely removed. There was no white gown pooled on the floor, no body, no evidence of a struggle, or even a descent. Just the void where she had been suspended moments before. Quillian's hand hung in the empty air, grasping at nothing. The Great Quillian, master of illusion, had performed an act of impossible reality, and he stood before the gasping crowd, a statue of horror, realizing his masterpiece had become his nightmare. For a terrible, stretched moment, the high society audience remained frozen, unable to process the empty space on the stage. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, ragged intake of Quillian's breath. Then, the terror broke loose. It didn't begin with a scream, but with a collective, guttural gasp, a sound of profound, shared understanding that the rules had been irrevocably violated. The wealthy patrons, who minutes earlier had been smugly appreciating the skill of the deception, now realized they had witnessed a truth they could not explain away. A woman near the front overturned her champagne table, the shattering glass a sharp punctuation mark in the escalating panic. People sprang from their seats, pushing and shoving toward the aisles, their expensive gowns and starched collars momentarily forgotten. The fear was primal, a fear of the impossible, of a demonstration that proved something truly unaccounted for existed beyond the stage's edge. Quillian remained motionless, his eyes glued to the spot where Adeline had dissolved. He didn't flee or make excuses, he simply stood as a silent, terrible monument to the vanishing. Outside the theater, the chaos spilled into the Boston street, a wave of well-dressed, terrified witnesses babbling incoherent stories to anyone who would listen. The Globe Theater, that grand venue of engineered deceit, had just become the epicenter of a true, baffling horror. The police arrived swiftly, responding to reports of riot and mass hysteria rather than a missing person. They found the Globe Theater in disarray, overturned chairs, abandoned belongings, and a smell of spilled liquor mixed with fear. Captain Hayes, a pragmatic man with no patience for theatrical nonsense, took charge. His first order was to secure the stage. Under the harsh, unromantic glare of emergency lanterns, the stage was instantly stripped of its magic. The illusion of grandeur collapsed, revealing rough wood and dusty rigging. Hayes and his men meticulously searched the space where Adeline had vanished. They probed the floorboards, checked the black velvet backdrop, and examined the small, ornate pedestal that remained. Their findings were zero. There was no trapdoor, no pit, no complex series of mirrored tunnels that Quillian was famous for. The floor was solid. The backdrops were secure. The very space where Miss Adeline was last seen was structurally sound and empty. The Master of Illusion's equipment was designed to hide bodies, but here, there was simply nothing to hide. Hayes stared at Quillian, who was now being held in a back room, guarded by 2 officers. The captain knew every trick in the book of stage magic, but the absolute lack of physical evidence, not a pin, not a scrap of lace, not a scuff mark, left him with a chilling conclusion. Either Quillian was a far greater genius than anyone imagined, or the woman had simply ceased to exist at that very spot. Captain Hayes found the great Quillian not distraught, but unervingly calm. He sat in the dressing room, the smell of grease paint and fear thick in the air. When questioned, Quillian offered no confession, no explanation, only an exhausted repetition of the facts. She was floating. She shimmered. She was gone, he stated, his voice a low monotone, devoid of his usual theatrical boom. Hayes was a man who understood motive and mechanism. He pressed Quillian hard on the logistics, the wires, the hidden platform, the trapdoor under the pedestal. Quillian simply looked at him with an intensity that made the captain uneasy. "I am the master of illusion, Captain," Quillian replied. "My job is to fool the eye. But tonight, my art failed. Not because of a faulty wire, but because there was no wire. I have no explanation for you because I have no explanation for myself. I saw what they saw. It was real." Quillian's perfect alibi was his curse. He was center stage, in full view of 200 witnesses. There was no physical act of violence he could have committed. The stage was searched and found clean. Hayes was left with an impossible dilemma. Either the city's most famous magician had perfected a trick so brilliant it defied all known physics, or he was genuinely the witness to a phenomenon he could not control. His absolute denial of knowing what happened seemed too profound to be a lie. It sounded like the genuine, helpless terror of a man who had lost his most crucial secret. The stage manager, Mr. Elias Thorne, was a man hardened by decades of theatrical deceit. He was the keeper of all of Quillian's secrets, the angles, the mirrors, the hidden ropes. When Captain Hayes questioned him, Thorne was initially dismissive, expecting to cover up a failed gag. But his demeanor quickly changed. "I know every trick the master has, Captain," Thorne muttered, running a weary hand over his face. "Every wire, every counterweight for the celestial suspension. And I tell you, that rig was empty. No platform, no hidden seat, nothing that could account for Miss Adeline." He confirmed that Quillian had been truly frozen by shock and not acting. But then, Thorne volunteered a strange, unsettling detail. About a week before the vanishing, he'd caught Adeline alone on stage late at night. She wasn't practicing her routine, She was staring up at the chandelier, seemingly speaking to someone who wasn't there. When Thorne asked her what she was doing, Adeline had given him a chilling, cryptic reply. "I'm learning the way out of the roof, Elias. The floor only goes down." Thorne had dismissed it as the nonsense of a stressed actress. Now, standing on the very stage where she had achieved a horrifying physical out, he wasn't so sure. His testimony confirmed the illusion's mechanism was sound, but it also introduced the horrifying possibility that Adeline had a profound, non-theatrical reason for wanting to ascend. The police search of Miss Adeline's personal dressing room yielded no immediate clues regarding her physical whereabouts, but offered a chilling glimpse into her state of mind. Unlike Quillian's cluttered, theatrical space, Adeline's room was sparse, almost monastic. Her clothes were neatly folded, her makeup minimal, and there was a strange, pervasive scent of ozone and something akin to burned sugar. The searchers were looking for letters, banknotes, or travel plans, anything suggesting she ran away. They found nothing of the sort. The room was immaculate, save for one crucial, disturbing item hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a thick, leather-bound journal. Inside, it contained no personal confessions or love letters. Instead, the pages were filled with obsessive, meticulous drawings of astronomical symbols, archaic constellations, complex geometric patterns, and star charts of systems far removed from our own. Interspersed between the celestial diagrams were dense mathematical equations, many crossed out and revisited, suggesting a years-long, frantic study. The final page, dated the morning of the vanishing, was not a drawing but a single, strange entry in neat script. "The path requires no hinge. The master's stage is merely the proper alignment." The discovery confirmed that Adeline was not merely an actress. She was either deeply troubled, or perhaps, a secret scholar dedicated to a terrifying, forgotten science. A science that culminated in her leaving the stage, and the planet for good. The disappearance was a feast for the press. Within 24 hours, the story had eclipsed all other news, dominating the front pages of every Boston paper, and quickly spreading across the nation. The headlines were sensational, abandoning any pretense of rational investigation. "Master magician murders mid-air," and "Vanishing act hides foul play." The focus quickly shifted from Adeline to Quillian. The master of illusion was now portrayed not as a genius, but as a sinister figure who had used his stagecraft to commit the perfect, untraceable crime. The name of his legendary act was tragically twisted. The press began referring to the incident not as an accident or a mystery, but as Quillian's curse. The theory went that the master had not only killed his assistant, but had somehow made her body permanently inaccessible, perhaps dissolving it with unknown chemicals hidden within the stage mechanisms. The tide of public opinion turned violently. The very society that had paid fortunes to see him now called for his head. Quillian was formally released from custody due to the complete lack of physical evidence, but his freedom was a mockery. His reputation was ruined, his genius inverted into monstrous capability. The media frenzy ensured that Miss Adeline's true, bizarre vanishing was buried beneath a far more comfortable, but utterly false narrative of betrayal and murder most ingenious. The master of illusion was now the pariah of Boston, a solitary figure haunted by his own empty stage. Less than 3 weeks after Miss Adeline's vanishing, the Globe Theatre met a violent, sudden end. In the dead of night, a massive fire erupted. Despite the swift response of the Boston Fire Department, the century-old building, lined with dried velvet and polished wood, was quickly engulfed. By dawn, only a smoldering shell remained. The official report deemed the cause accidental, citing faulty gas lines backstage. But to the detectives still quietly working the case, the timing was far too convenient. The inferno had meticulously consumed every last piece of physical evidence tied to the vanishing. The stage floor where Adeline had stood, the rigging of the celestial suspension, and Quillian's personal workshop where his props were stored. Captain Hayes suspected insurance fraud or a desperate act by Quillian to destroy the scene of his inexplicable failure. However, Quillian was proven to be miles away, and the theater was heavily underinsured. The only plausible alternative was chilling. Someone or something was actively trying to bury the secret of the vanishing. The disappearance was a violation of physics. The fire was a deliberate, violent effort to erase the possibility of ever proving it. The gilded cage had been reduced to ashes, ensuring that the mystery of the floating woman could never be solved through earthly means. The Great Quillian vanished from the public eye almost as completely as Miss Adeline had vanished from his stage. Shunned by society and facing financial ruin, he retreated to a small, isolated house on the New England coast. His once grand reputation as the master of illusion was replaced by a morbid new identity, the broken artist who witnessed a reality he couldn't replicate or explain. He spent his days in a self-imposed exile, not mourning the woman, but obsessively studying the one piece of physical evidence left behind, Adeline's journal. He pored over the astronomical charts and complex geometry, his magician's mind trying to find a mechanical equivalent for her alien script. He realized the equations were not for building a machine, but for finding a location, a point in space or perhaps a vibrational frequency. Quillian, the man who had perfected the art of deception, was now obsessed with a terrifying truth. He believed Adeline had not been a victim, but a pioneer, a scholar who had used his stage, his controlled, focused environment, as the final catalyst for a journey. He had provided the spotlight, the intensity, and the collective human belief necessary to achieve her purpose. He hadn't killed her. He had merely helped her find the way out of the roof she had spoken of. He lived out his remaining years, a hollow shadow, forever staring up at the night sky, waiting for a sign of the woman who had ascended beyond his, or anyone's, magic. The disappearance of Miss Adeline vanishing was never solved, never closed, and never adequately explained. Decades later, the case file rests in the musty archives of the Boston Police Department, catalogued under missing persons, circumstances highly irregular. The final report notes the overwhelming eyewitness testimony, the complete lack of physical evidence, and the destructive fire that conveniently wiped the stage clean. Captain Hayes, before his retirement, penned a final, frustrated addendum. He conceded that every conventional explanation, murder, elaborate escape, or stage trick, had failed under scrutiny. He stated that the facts required an explanation that went beyond the jurisdiction of law enforcement. The enduring mystery lies in the single, immutable fact. For 1 second on that October night in 1907, inside the Globe Theatre, the laws of physics failed. A woman was suspended mid-air by an unseen force, shimmered with unnatural heat, and then, with a soundless pop, left the world entirely. The master of illusion died a broken man, convinced he had facilitated an ascension, not a crime. The audience was scarred by the memory of witnessing an impossible truth. The only certainty left behind is the haunting idea that Adeline, using the stage's powerful focus and Quillian's intense showmanship, managed to align herself with something ancient and star-bound. The case remains a cold, open file, a terrifying reminder that sometimes the magic is not in the trick, but in the realization that there are forces that will simply not be contained by our world.